Dear friends, in another Monday evening, we are together. This evening, in our 29th video, we will continue going deeper into the topic of conscience.
Good evening, everyone.
We wish you a good and healthy week. Number of cases is increasing and the world is in turmoil in many ways. All kinds of tests and trials we are in, and horizontal influences are pressing all of us so we can direct our attention to the vertical influences. What are your impressions?
Yes, bad and relatively good news are keep on coming. The new variant of the last week seems a little bit easier to deal with. And we hope to get infected such variants so our bodies can create a natural immunization. And as the number of the cases increases, the number of observations increases, too. A whole apartment block has been under quarantine, but we hear that some of the tenants left their mobile phones at home not to be detected and went to shopping. And I think to myself, I care for their health, I feel responsible for them, but they do not take their own responsibility. As I witness the tests and trials that they go through because of the choices they make, I also witness the pendulum within me swinging back and forth between duty and earthly cravings. Such interesting times we are living in. Still, I think, the sense of responsibility is the most important for the wellness and wholeness of individuals and also of communal life. And as I observe how we fail in choosing responsibly, I think that we will be living through harder tests and trials to learn this lesson.
Our friends are commenting that they find our videos very useful. We thank you for your attendance and presence. This reading and commentary series are good for us, as well. Because we miss our gatherings for lectures and inner studies. The silver lining is now, with these online lectures and meetings, we can reach a wider audience. And reading your comments and feedback is so valuable for us. Together, each of us is trying to maintain our connection to our beings, to take a deep breath and pause for a few hours in the midst of currently pessimistic atmosphere, and together, we try to change our view of the world and our life. Yes, let's continue reading. After summarily giving the general scheme of the developmental mechanism belonging to beings, we now begin to explain how it works, how it should work in the mankind's life and in which ways it makes progress. When following the development of the conscience mechanism in mankind, it is not correct to put some states and capabilities such as love, altruism, earthly cravings, conscience in an order as it has been done generally. For example, it is wrong to arrange an absolute sequence in which the stage of altruism comes first, then the stage of love or of conscience definitely following it. Here only, throughout the life of mankind, components of conscience, which are both opposing and complementing each other and directed to duty and earthly cravings, advance against each as the two opposites of a whole. Therefore, the conscience mechanism, which puts into effect the preparation for the sense of duty in the world, exhibits a state of a two-sided whole which sometimes leads in the direction of earthly cravings and sometimes in the direction of duty, and the capabilities we listed above take the states of equilibrium within this whole on its positive and negative sides, which are adjusted to the suitable situations and needs of its every level, and of the opposites ensuring the equilibrium. The higher one is directed to the plan of duty and the lower one is directed to earthly cravings. For example, if the sense of considering others is a higher reality which is more converging to the plan of duty, the selfishness which stands against it as the opposite constitutes the lower reality. However, it should be remembered that actually both of these are but a two-sided appearance of the same value which displays opposing qualities in accordance with the duality principle. We will explain the meaning of these opposites better as we continue to talk about the topic of conscience. Therefore, the conscience is a powerful mechanism which convergences on human comprehension towards the knowledge of duty, in a complete state of duality unit with its both positive and negative sides. This mechanism prepares the instincts at the stage of plant to the automatisms of the stage of animal, the automatisms at the stage of animal to the stage of sense of duty in human life and mankind to the comprehensions of the intuition and knowledge of duty, that is, to the plan of duty.
Last week, we had read and discussed that the conscience is a developmental mechanism, and it has various appearances in different stages of development. That is, and its appearances in the stages of plant and animal are not perceivable for human comprehension. Now, at the first paragraph of this passage, the book reminds this fact again. And, we must emphasize that we cannot say any more that this or that person is conscienceless or lacking a conscience. Because we now understand that the conscience is an inseparable part of a duality unit, that is, a mechanism that has two sides or opposites. One is oriented to the sense of duty and the other is oriented to the earthly cravings or selfishness. I mean, these two are not separate concepts, they are within a duality unit. The book underlines this fact, and also, states that this development does not progress in a linear manner. It is not like first the stage of altruism comes, then the stage of love follows it. No, this development occurs by swinging back and forth between these opposite sides, in accordance with the needs and level of comprehension of the being. Previously, we had been thinking that these stages follow each other in a strict line towards the sense of duty. Yet, in the divine order in the universe, we read that it is not necessarily so. Depending on the needs and comprehension of the being, the appearances of this developmental mechanism will occur as various arrangements of events. We will read in the further pages of the book, but let me mention this very important point. Had not been this part of earthly cravings of this duality mechanism, then we would be talking about a development without any efforts towards the higher values. And also, even our current level is a lower level when compared to our further level. And when we understand this, then we cannot stop at a level which feels all right to us. There are always higher and higher levels of our development, and each level also consists both sides of this duality in varying degrees. I mean, we cannot say that, now I must act altruistically, because even if we reached such a level, this level still contains the realities, thoughts and feelings related to the earthly cravings. There are so many variations of the feelings, habits, the parts that need to be transformed within us that this mechanism contains all of these varying degrees of both sides of our duality unit as a whole. In short, this duality unit is intrinsic, emerging with the first particle of matter and working in each duality unit, no matter what the size or level the matter parts and the beings are. It drives us to make efforts in order to develop towards the ever higher states of ourself. It is valid for this book, as well. It gives us the knowledge, but to understand this knowledge and to apply this knowledge in our life, demand our efforts and super efforts. Had reading this book and comprehending all of it at once been possible, then now all of us would be enlightened.
Yes, for many years I had witnessed that some regular visitors to our society's lectures were always asking about this book. When will it be disclosed? When? Yet, when this book is published in 2013, I witnessed that many of those regular visitors experienced a big disappointment. And I understood that they had a great expectation. They would read this book and then they would be enlightened. They were expecting maybe something sensational, something that may make them feel special, or something easier. Maybe, in their minds, they were expecting to find a shortcut, a bypass to the spiritual realms they assumed they were ready for. They wanted their lifetime to be the last one in this world. And I am sure you sometimes hear people say that let this be my last life in the world, but by our current level of comprehension, none of us certainly knows the life plan outlined by our beings, and its place in the greater purpose of the system. But, as you said, to understand this knowledge and to apply this knowledge in our life, demand our efforts and super efforts. That's the reason of this reading and commentary series, to make efforts together, to create a mutual field of working towards this goal. And together we read in this book that all efforts we make in this world during our lifetime, and also the all appearances of the world is not only personal, but also communal. Yes, when we say earthly cravings, this term may contain many things, like selfishness, acting on self-interest, not caring for others, not respecting others, etc. But when we say altruism, what do we mean by this term? In our previous videos, we had discussed the widening of our capacity for responsibility. We had mentioned how a family is a duality unit in itself, and how our sense of responsibility widens, first, becoming responsible for the family, then, for the community, then, for the country, then, for the world we live in, then, for our universe, and how this developmental mechanism can display infinite appearances. And now, as each of us gradually advancing towards taking responsibilities within the cadres of duty in different points of the universe, searching for shortcuts or for gains without spending efforts actually bring us suffering, more tests and trials, but most of all, disappointments, and we get stuck under those shattered imaginary dreams and fantasizes. Yes, there are many teachings and practices out there that may be soothing the egoistical side of us, claiming that their followers will be saved during the world upheavals, but as we mentioned before, for the ones who cannot discern such teachings, the ground becomes more slippery. As Mr. Ruhselman said many times, the most important thing on the path of evolution we must hold on to is our conscience. And we read in this book the most emphasized topic is conscience. As we read on, we will have more examples of applications of conscience in the book. For example, last week, we read and discussed the appearance of this developmental mechanism at the initial phase of the human stage. The book gave an example of a mother, about how the maternal instincts of a female are different than a female at the animal stage. And as the being progress in the human stage, these instincts turn into automatism, but as the progress continue, automatisms weaken. Contemporary philosophers and researchers of the spiral dynamics theory create nice graphics showing the progress of human consciousness. At this initial phase, human beings gradually become self-aware. They survive through instincts and they band with other human beings to increase the chance of survival. Then comes a mystic magic phase. They see the effects of natural elements as punishment or reward. Then gradually they pass to a tribal phase. In the further phases of the human stages, they gradually become more rational. And now, these researchers say that we are moving towards the integrative phase, and the characteristics of this phase are the taking individual responsibility, but at the same time, widening this sense of responsibility toward a more integrating whole. And when we think about the human history as advancing on this dynamic spiral of consciousness, we see that all is all about power, all those power struggles to gain power and using that power over others. But what about inner power? Gaining power but mastering it? What is your real intention for gaining power? Will you use it for the greater good or for only your own benefits? It is easy to observe these opposing sides of the duality mechanism in the current appearances of power in our world. And as we read this passage made me think that we need to change our concept of consecutive lifetimes lived by conscience or lifetimes lived by earthly cravings. Those 500 to 700 lifetimes look like they don't follow each other in a certain order, first on that and later on other side, but like a swinging pendulum, going back and forth between these opposing sides. All right, let's continue reading. This developmental mechanism that has reached the stage of humanity is left to man's comprehension and freedom of will, which has more or less emerged. In this way, to whichever opposite of the conscience duality man directs his efforts through the comprehension and freedom of will he is obliged to use, to whichever opposite he adds more value, the equilibrium disrupts in the favor of that opposite. 4. Orientating to a matter combination means sending influences to it, and the influences that are sent are the corresponding values and entail value differentiation in favor of that side.
In the previous weeks, we had read and discussed some passages about the influences and praying, our friends may remember. If we think about the mechanism there, not only our prayers but any kind of orientations, attention, wishes, desires etc. means that we send out values towards that influence we will orient to. That passage was useful about explaining this part of the mechanism. Now, when we take a human being, within us, there are inner states that are oriented to earthly cravings, and also, that are oriented to the duty. Let's say, if we put more weight on our instincts, desires and habits, and if we give more attention or concentration towards these, if we spend more efforts towards these, mental or emotional, then we begin to feed these, and the neutral line becomes pulled down to the lower part, that is, earthly cravings. Yes, the freedom of will is not apparent in plants and animals, and even at the initial phases of the human stage, there is an intense automatism in those stages and phases. But, for the further phases of the human stage, as the comprehension of the being widens, the human being begins to perceive and understand the consequences of his or her actions, even if these are based on free will, and starts to limit his or her freedom willingly, especially when the human being becomes able to comprehend to which part she or he needs to orient to, and by making choices towards this purpose, the human being willingly begins to avoid some other things that may hinder this purpose. But even this currently better choosing is still a lower reality when compared to the next stage a human being will reach, still an earthly craving. Let's say, a person who reads this book and wants to understand the topic of comprehension, he wants this, but when it is time to study, read, or think about this topic, that person makes a cup of coffee or tea, but instead of sending more values towards acquiring a studying mode, and consequently, invite more subliming influences in that regard, that person succumbs the weight of his or her comfort zone which contains laziness, indifference, in short all those earthly wants and desires pulling her or him down, and soon gives up the idea of studying, and finds himself or herself on a couch, watching a TV drama. Then, that person can beat himself or herself up, saying that, why I can't do things I intended to do? Those kind of feelings makes that person go further down. However, if that person spends some more effort to feed his or her wish to study this topic of comprehension, the sublimating influences that will bring more values will support this studying mode, and soon, that person find herself or himself immersed in study and spending more efforts to study the topic. That person may discover new insights, may have more questions about the topic, etc. But after completing this task, the same person can sit down and watch his or her TV drama, after all, but with the fulfillment of completing his or her first task, and the fulfillment of mastering the laziness or indifference. Of course, this example I can now think of, can be in myriad variations for each of us.
Yes, sustaining the balance within us. We have the criteria here, the balance, the equilibrium between these two opposing sides. To which side we send values, that is, to which side we orient to, we add values to that side. So, a value differentiation occurs in favor of that part. Let's say we add values to the side of duty, that is, each effort we make towards understanding ourself, understanding the divine order, exploring your inner world makes us get closer to our essence, to our being. However, if we add more values to the side of the earthly cravings, all those desires, wants and habits tend to obscure, numb and even sever our connection to our being. We are expected to swing between these opposite sides in a way that as we learn more about ourselves and get closer to the sublimating influences, we become more able to master all crude and subtle variations of matter. And which is good or bad? There is no such labeling, but there is the imperative of facing the consequences of our choices we make towards either side. Yes, let's continue reading. Now, we will elaborate on the conscience mechanism's way of working. In any level of development, conscience duality's higher reality, which we call positive, and lower reality of earthly cravings, which we relatively call negative, stays in equilibrium in man. That is, the values they contain preserve the status quo among them. Nevertheless, this equilibrium here does not always stay fixed, it is disrupted every moment. However, as we have previously said, all disrupted duality equilibria are inclined to be restored, to be balanced again. In accordance with the duality principle, opposites of the disrupted equilibrium never stay in that state. Whichever side of the equilibrium is disrupted by receiving more values, in order to restore it, from that opposite to the weak one, starts a flux of values. And this entails the increase of the value level of the opposing negative side up to the level of the positive opposite. In this way, the new level of equilibrium which is restored between the positive side that increased its level by receiving higher values actually enters into a superior state in comparison with the previous state, and this means that the duality unit has passed on to a higher level, that is, comprehension in the conscience mechanism has converged on the knowledge of duty a little bit more. On the contrary, if more values are sent to the negative opposite, that is, to the earthly cravings, although the process is the same as before, the direction is reversed. In this case, the duality unit, that is, the conscience, starts to shift a level down. And shifting of the conscience to lower levels means the beginning of it losing its higher values, about which mankind uses terms like silencing or blinding the conscience upon looking at the appearances. Thus, for the former states, they talk about strengthening of the conscience. However, general evolutionary principles do not consent for any beings constantly going downwards. If this is the case, that is, if a man shifts the equilibrium always downwards by continuously sending values to the opposite and enters into a state of inability to free himself from abusing this comprehension and freedom of will, then beings in duty, who are obliged to help him, consign him to a necessary automatism by immediately sending him strong influences. That is, a more or less similar thing occurs in the initial stages of humanity. They try to ensure his comprehension and will to be directed automatically to the higher opposite by putting before him some attractive or repulsive critical events. Naturally, this state, which carries with it a more or less a compelling character, does not occur with ease, unlike the way it does with free will. On the contrary, the suffering and troubling qualities of innumerable events that will be brought forth as the imperatives of automatism would prepare for him many struggles, pains and even, if needed, tortures and deaths, until they direct the will of that man into the path so that his will may acquire the power to orientate to the required opposite side which he could not use in his free state.
In this passage, we first read about the conscience mechanism's way of working. And in this passage, the part oriented towards the sense of duty is named as positive, and the part oriented towards the earthly cravings is named, relatively negative. And, again, as the book mentions the positive side, we read here, receiving higher values, that is, the duality. And we must remember that everything we see, observe and know in the matter universe is of matter, nothing else but matter. Even our emotions, feelings, thoughts, whatever we deem sublime are matter. And all matter has their own magnetic fields, and all of them are in constant exchange of influences. They receive and send influences to each other. And we see that, in any given level of conscience or the any given point of the equilibrium at a given moment, the state of matter what we deem as higher component of that level or point generally has a more complex structure. So, any higher component requires an effort from the lower component so it can send, let's say, an invitation to the higher component, so that higher component can send higher values to the lower component. And this is valid for everything, our realities, emotions, habits. In order to master whatever is a lower component in comparison with the higher component, we need to orient towards higher values, otherwise, the equilibrium becomes disrupted in favor of the lower component, and if this disruption continues, then the beings in duty has to intervene, and some automatisms are put on our path, unless we willingly orient towards the positive, towards the higher component. For example, let's consider a person who is inclined to violence, and has hurt many others. Let's say, that person encounters an event and has to respond to this event. Although this event has various influences, that person, because of the inner instincts and habitual dynamics, will most probably be in sync with the influences suggesting violence. But within this event there are also influences suggesting non-violence, but for that person, these are higher component, a higher reality. Let's say, this person had started to see and understand the consequences of his own anger and violent manners, and had started to comprehend worse results may happen, then this person can be able to reach up for inviting these higher values of non-violence, and instead of giving a habitual violent reaction, he makes a non-violent choice and respond to this event. Let's say, he is not physically violent anymore, he tried and succeeded in mastering those physical violent side by adding higher values into his duality unit. At this point, for that person, a totally new reality, a new level of conscience begins. Because, there is a new higher component exists for that person. Becoming non-violent in mental world. Because we are also responsible for our thoughts. Let's say, that person is driving in heavy traffic. He doesn't stop the car and beat another driver but, in his mind, until arriving his destination, he does worse things to the other driver. So, the next higher component rises for this person as a higher reality of responsibility not only for his actions but also for his thoughts. And then, that person needs to spend efforts in that direction. As you can see, this is such a sequence that these lower and higher components are like the rings of a chain. Any higher component we could reach becomes the lower component because there is now another higher component. And another example, I can give, from my observations about some acquaintances, those people, whenever they will act on something, let's say an investment, a start-up or buying something, they always consult some mentors, not because those mentors are more experienced about the subject but because they don't want to take the responsibility of making their own decisions or choices. They want those mentors to shoulder this responsibility. I am sure, our friends have their observations about such people. You hear them always saying, as my teacher advised, as my guru told me, as my mentor suggested, etc. And at some point in their life, some awareness needs to be given those people that they need to take the responsibility for their own decisions. And we hear the news how they are conned or abused by their so-called mentors, how they lose their money, their reputation, etc. They become directed into some hardships, an imperative automatism, into really deep thinking about shirking their own responsibility. Please don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that you should not consult others. Of course, we need to consult well-informed or more experienced people before making such decisions relying on our own conscience and comprehension. But we should not surrender our will to others. This is what I wanted to underline. Because none of us has total comprehension, and at best, we are semi-comprehending, the most ideal thing to do is to know ourself, our weak points, our instincts, our habits. How is our inner world? What motivates us in orienting to the positive side? What motivates us in orienting to the negative side? What drives us? We must study ourselves. Only then we can gain the ability of seeing possible outcomes of our actions from different perspectives, of becoming emphatic to others' perspectives, of recognizing the dynamics behind our actions and choices that we made so far. Only then, we can be able to choose differently, that is, to discern what is the lower component and what is the higher component of our intended action or choice. Such discernment requires us to study ourselves, to know ourselves. We need to work on ourselves. Because each of us is at a different level of conscience, at a different level of comprehension, what a higher component for someone is a lower component for someone else. This is why I wanted to underline the possible pitfalls of consulting other people about the decisions we need to make. What they may advise us may not be in the level of conscience we need to be. There is an example from one of Mr. Ruhselman's earlier books. Two friends, as they walk on the road, a beggar approaches them. One of the men takes out some coins from his wallet and gives to the beggar, saying to himself, "That man needs this money more than I do," and in the terms of his conscience, he feels happy about his deed. Within this man's own inner dynamics, this is the deed he conscientiously needs to do. However, the other man thinks that if he gives some money to the beggar, this may encourage beggar's laziness, and because the beggar looks healthy and could easily work to earn money instead of begging, not giving him money will be a more beneficial deed. And Mr. Ruhselman asks, which action is right, and answers, both actions are right. The higher component for the first man was giving money to the beggar. The higher component for the second man was not giving money to the beggar. And because of this varying degrees and levels of comprehensions and consciences, there cannot be a communal conscience. communities, peoples, nations can only have ethical rules and norms. The conscience is a developmental mechanism that belonging to the individual human being. And our purpose here is to be able to recognize or discern our lower and higher components in that level of reality, and to spend more efforts to be oriented towards the higher components that we call the conscience, so we can elevate the middle line of this duality mechanism higher and higher. And by doing this, we feel the inner peace of approaching to the plan of duty a little bit closer. And this natural inner peace, when compared to the inner restlessness we feel when we think and act from the lower components, is another way of discerning if we add more values to the earthly cravings instead of inviting more sublimating values to our organism. So, if you feel restless, feel that you are dealing with meaningless and vain sufferings, then pause, and let your comprehension wander among the lower components of your reality, to see if you favored earthly cravings more than higher components of your conscience. Just check if you added more values to your emotions, feelings, beliefs, thoughts, ideas, habits, desires, wants. And start adding more values to the higher components. However, this is easier to said than done. This requires from us efforts and super efforts.
And we learn to do this, willingly or unwillingly, relatively fast or gradually, as we live the life we are born into. I'd like to underline that the natural inner peace you meant is not the peace of mind people may experience in, let's say, in retreats at the mountain tops, because the real test is life itself, and it says, come on, mingle with people and let's see if this peace you feel continues or not. Your words reminded me a taxi driver I met years ago. This was a very valuable experience for me. Back then, I was traveling frequently, and after a business trip, my plane landed in Istanbul and I took a taxi. Traffic was heavy and that taxi driver and I started to talk. At some point, the man said, "You know, sister, I am just out of the prison." And I asked, why you were in prison? He said, I killed a man and I was sentenced 35 years. I said, good that your sentence is done, now. Good that you started a new life. And he said, I'd like to ask you something. I'd like to hear what you think, and told me that his father and brother had took over his properties while he was in prison. And he said, now, a part of me says that go and shoot them. But another part of me says you already spent 35 years in prison. Don't do that because you will go back to prison again. He was hesitant, ambivalent between these two parts of him. When he asked for my opinion, I told him, let's say you kill them, what will happen? He replied, I will get back what was mine and be in peace. Then I asked, let's say you don't kill them, then what will happen? He replied, I just got my freedom back. Again, I asked, what do you feel that now you got your freedom back? He replied, I felt peace. Then I said, so, the mutual purpose of this part that says go and kill them and that part that says don't kill them is to give you peace. Now, just check, which piece is more valuable, more precious for you? Until we arrive at my destination, we talked about pros and cons of those choices, and when he stopped the car and taking my luggage out, he told me, sister, I didn't understand most of the things you told me, but I understood that you told me good things. And of course, I hadn't encountered this man in vain. I needed this observation for my own reasons. Yes, our friends are writing comments, saying that we must share such experiences instead of using the concepts and terms of the book because these concepts and terms sound academic to their ears. And if we share such experiences, easier to understand, more people watch this video series. Let me remind you, dear friends, the purpose of this The Divine Order and the Universe Reading and Commentary series is to study this concentrated knowledge and to reach some understanding this knowledge at a relatively higher level of comprehension. Or in other words, the terms and concepts of this book is the higher component for all of us, so we are, together with you, trying to spend efforts to understand it, as much as possible, at the level it is given, and naturally, this requires from us more attention, more effort to understand it. And the most important thing for us, the mechanism of influences explained in this book, This book is not only for the people who read this book, it is for whole mankind. This flux of influence is raining on all mankind. The whole universe is exposed to these influences. Because of this mechanism is not about the quantity but about the quality, especially quality of the responses of the beings to these influences.
Conveying the knowledge given in this book without referring the terms and concepts explained in this book would be repeating what we already know. But this book states that we are in the brink of a new reality, a new level of comprehension at this phase of the human stage. And because of this book conveys new and deeper meanings to those terms and concepts. And we need a mutual terminology, a mutual ground to gain the same meanings. So, until we reach that mutual ground for understanding, we will keep on using these terms and concepts.
Alright, let's continue reading. Now, let us pass to the opposite components of the conscience which orientate to duty and earthly cravings. Two components appearing opposite to each other in the conscience mechanism in any level are the higher and lower rings, interlocked and particular to that level, of the chain of realities which are sequenced from below to above and arranged in accordance with the imperatives and necessities of the needs, in a preliminary quality for preparing a man with the knowledge of the plan of duty. We define the reality constituting the lower ring as directed to earthly cravings, and the higher ring to the duty. This chain, as it extends from below to above, is from past to future. When we say that the lower one is directed to earthly cravings, we mean the reality which has been lived, and when we say the higher one is directed to duty, we mean the reality which will be lived. Thus, each component of the conscience mechanism contains the lived and to-be-lived realities of man's life. A reality which completed its cycle stands against a higher reality which has the quality of converging the man a little bit more to the plan of duty. And this is why we call it the earthly cravings. However, it should be remembered that this lower reality which hinders the higher one for that moment has been the higher reality of the previous level, which prepared that higher level of conscience.
We must remember that this chain mentioned doesn't mean that realities follow each other in a certain succession. On the contrary, this sequence varies depending on the developmental needs and the level of comprehension of a person or of a being or the evolutionary needs of a spirit. Again, we must remember that this negative side, or the earthly craving side, egoistical side is very necessary as an indication of the merit and efforts of a being, otherwise, it would be an automatic development, without a meaning, or without an added value. Then, this would be not the evolution as we understand as a concept. Also, we read in this passage, thus, each component of the conscience mechanism contains the lived and to-be-lived realities of man's life. A reality which completed its cycle stands against a higher reality which has the quality of converging the man a little bit more to the plan of duty. When talking about conscience, we mostly think about the need of mastering negative feelings etc., but here we see that whatever we had experienced, had impressions about and reflected back to our being, so our being adds it to its essential knowledge also becomes a lower component for us. In other words, past becomes the lower component and future becomes the higher component. I think, this knowledge must us to think about the things that have passed but we still cling to.
You know, we see all those variations of love reality at lower stages and higher stages. At the lower stage, love of a lover is possessive. You know there is this pop culture saying about love, you are either mine or in grave. It is rather at the earthly craving side. If I cannot have you, no one else can have you. A higher level of love, and this example is given in the divine order and the universe. A lover, if rejected by the beloved, does not display a possessive manner, but in order to become better in the eyes of the beloved, the lover works for adding values to himself, let's say, to be more educated, more experienced, more developed. And the next higher level, the lover, if rejected, respects the choice of the beloved. So, a human being starts at the lower stages of each reality but by gradual development, moves on the higher and higher stages of that reality. In that sense, the main purpose is to embark on the path of any reality, to become active, to move on first with the attraction of the earthly cravings and then move up to higher components or levels of any reality to become gradually closer to the sense of duty. And all those events we encounter on the path bring along the tests and trials as we swing between the choices that we make from either side of this duality mechanism. We see the same gradual development in all developmental stages of a human being, starting from childhood to adulthood. Now, you are a father and I am sure you have many observations. A young child names everything as mine, mother is mine, father is mine, this toy is mine, and for example, when the attention of the mother dwindles a little, let's say as she talks to another person or a child, the kid goes and puts a hand on the mother's mouth. In time, it becomes easier to convince the same child to share parents, persons and objects with other siblings or other kids. Actually, we witness that child's moving on the path of his or her reality, starting from lower components to the higher components. And of course, the age doesn't mean the maturity, as there are many realities within us where we are still at the lower components. And this is why when we look at the appearances, we generally say things are so bad in the world, yet when we think about the number of beings trying to complete the lessons which they previously failed, this swinging back and forth between the opposite sides of the duality mechanism is more obvious, more perceptible. And, again, the outer appearances are deceiving. Let's say, using cutting-edge technology gadgets doesn't mean that we are in higher levels of our development. There are many beings that are still in the egoistical side of the equilibrium, in the sense of capacity for love and understanding. Just as there are many beings who does not have those kind material goods and riches but very developed in the sense of compassion, love and conscience. If we only look at the tip of the iceberg, we can miss the larger part of it. The spectrum is so wide. That's why we are trying to see the bigger picture, from a perspective that includes the past and future levels in the development of beings. Yes, soon, we will publish a Q&A video, and we will try to answer your questions. We hope that our videos are useful for you to understand the concepts explained in the divine order and the universe. We try to do our best to clarify these terms and concepts as much as we can in our current level of understanding and comprehension. Yes, it is time to wish you a good evening, dear friends. Hoping to see you all next week.
Good evening, dear friends.